Welcome to the Air Force Doctrine Podcast. On this episode, I sit down with Colonel Scott Hazy, Chief of the Personnel Recovery and Joint Integration Division within Air Combat Command's Operations Directorate. We discuss Air Force Counterland Doctrine, including the Tactical Air Control Party community, command and control of air-to-land integration with the land component, airspace control over U.S. Army forces, and the future of close air support and air interdiction. Please join us. All right, good morning, Colonel Hazy, and thanks for joining us today on the Air Force Doctrine Podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Hey, thanks, Paps. I'm really excited to be here and look forward to having this discussion.
Awesome. And before we dive into this, can you give us your background? Where are you from? What's your career been like? Just to give our listeners some context of where you're at right now and where you've been.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at in the world. Colonel Scott Hazy. I'm the Personal Recovery and Joint Integration Division Chief at ACA3. One of the portions of my portfolio is the Tactical Air Control Party and its associated capabilities. Myself, I am an air battle manager, 13 Bravo, flew 10 years on JSTARS and 2 different 5-year tours. In the middle of those, I had the opportunity and privilege of being an air liaison officer on an Alpha tour with the Tactical Air Control Party, predominantly out of then Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, with the 18th Airborne Corps and the 18th ASOG, and then also the 82nd Airborne Division. I've been a squadron commander, a squadron DO, and a deck commander of TACP. And then again, where I'm sitting at now is the division chief overseeing TACP operations for the CAF.
Excellent. So you've had a lot of experience working with both the command and control community and our TACP community, as well as the U.S. Army in your role as an ALO. So you've kind of seen a lot of our air-to-ground integration capabilities and what we bring to the fight. So I'm glad I got you on the podcast to talk about Counterland Doctrine, how the Air Force does counterland, and to talk about our TACP community and how we integrate with the Army. So, sir, I wanted to give you a chance to inform our listeners a little bit more about TACP. I think a lot of them at the service level know generally, hey, the TACPs, they're the guys on the ground, but who are TACP airmen and what role do they play in air-to-land integration?
So TACP airmen, it is a career field that for a lot of people, especially in the last 20 years, has taken on a single mantra of a JTAC career field that is only useful as a close air support asset. And that's just one element of what TACP brings to the fight. TACP, by nature, they are the Common Force leader in air power integration, tactical command and control communications experts, being a ground sensor and strike executor, coordinate lethal and non-lethal air power using our technologies, exploiting multiple waveforms. We also deliver forward-edge battle management. Again, so being a command and control asset, it doesn't matter if we're controlling kinetic fires or just trying to get a fighter to the next target, whether that's short of the fissile or along the fissile. We take the business of command and control very seriously. And then again, being a joint firepower integrator, we don't necessarily care about the delivery asset or what the weapon is. Our job is to integrate fires on the battlefield to meet the Joint Force Commander's intent.
Before we go any further, I forgot to clarify. So TACP, for our listeners, Tactical Air Control Party airmen, and there's a wide variety of different types of TACP airmen or individuals who could be considered part of the TACP. But then within that, you also have JTACs. Those are your Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, and those are service members. They're qualified to provide weapons release clearance to aircraft for air-to-surface employment. So JTACs are just a subset of TACP. Is that a good way to say that?
JTAC is a certification. It doesn't necessarily have to be a certain person or a certain AFSC. The Air Force just has dedicated groups of personnel within the TACP career field, but you also have people in the CCT world, so in the combat control world that get qualifications. In the past, we've had some pararescuemen that go towards that path as well. And then obviously rated ALOs. We've had fighter pilots as well. That way they could do the PAC-A mission, things like that. And then cross-service and multinational, right? So there's a memorandum of agreement that warrants what it takes to be a baseline JTAC within the coalition as well. So JTAC is just certification that gives you the ability to do terminal control weaponry on the battlefield.
Okay. So your TACPs, with a lot of those TACPs that are JTAC qualified, they're going to perform roles as what we would consider battalion JTACs. So they're your TACPs that are integrated with the Army. So they're out there rolling around with the Army as they move across the battlefield, working with the ground commanders to coordinate for air-to-surface fire integration. So there's TAC-P on the battlefield, and there are also TAC-P in a command and control node called the ASOC, correct?
Yeah, in the traditional sense, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit later about like how some things are changing for us based off of manpower and just the necessity to change the way we do business based off the evolving battlefield. But yeah, what you're saying, traditionally TAC-P, we align from the core level of the Army down to the battalion level of the Army, and then from there we were able to push manpower out with the teams as they go outside the wire to do missions or in the linear battlefield. As they make maneuver to gain objectives, they will generally have a TAC-P in that forward echelon to meet commander's intent when it comes to fires integration.
Yeah, and the battalion JTACs are the ones they're doing the terminal attack control for close air support. Close air support's that mission set where it's air to surface fires in close proximity to friendly forces that requires detailed integration with the fire and maneuver of those forces. That's your definition out of the 3093, the joint pub. So we've got TAC-Ps that are doing close air support, and then we have TAC-Ps in the ASOC, which right now ASOCs are doctrinally aligned at the division, and those TAC-P are responsible. That's a C2 node that's subordinate to the Air Operations Center, and it facilitates air component integration with the land component for that division. Just so our listeners understand too, and can clarify, what's the difference between TAC-P at the ASOC, which is co-located with the division, versus the battalion TAC-P, who are your JTACs that are actually conducting CAS. Did the TAC-P in the ASOCs or out on the battalions, did they do anything with the air interdiction mission? Are they involved in air interdiction mission sets at all?
Yeah, so currently the way things are going, what you're seeing was with the ASOC to division move, the evolution of the Joint Air-Ground Integration Cell, the JAGIC, we had an ASOC team parts of that, and then one of the positions that was within that was also an interdiction coordinator. So TAC-P, based off, again, command and control capabilities and trying to get effects on the battlefield, doing interdiction coordination, whether that's through SCAR or long-range fires or, using aerial fires, that doesn't require that detailed integration based off proximity friendlies. Yeah, that's something we can do, right? And it really comes down to a mindset more than anything else. We're trained to put things on the battlefield to make effects, much like I was trained in the E8 to do interdiction, strike coordination, and command control from an airplane.
Okay, excellent. The TAC-P community's got a wide variety of missions that they can accomplish. They're pretty highly trained in each one of those. So, Colonel Hazy, we keep hearing about the TAC-P community being reduced. Over the last few years, we've seen a reduction in the TAC-P community. Where does the TAC-P community stand with their programmatics of the community being reduced, and how does the TAC-P community look going forward? In my opinion, like, everyone wants to talk about platforms in the Air Force, and as a hog dude especially, we're talking about the A-10 going away and stuff, but I'm actually really concerned just about the close air support community writ large, and our TAC-Ps are a huge part of that. So a lot of our institutional knowledge on how to do close air support, air land integration is tied up in the TAC-P community. So where's the TAC-P community stand, and where are they headed? What can you give us on that?
Yeah, so the Air Force had to make some tough budgeting decisions, right? You talked about the hog going away, which is near and dear to a lot of TAC-P's heart. But at the end of the day, the Air Force has a budget. And as we're evolving and changing, they had to find ways to make best use of the dollars and cents. And there were decisions made, and one of those was a reduction to TAC-P. And so we're finishing up. We're in the last round of manpower cuts right now, realizing the goals that the Air Force put in front of us. That does put a strain on what the career field is able to do, but we're trying to leverage our capabilities through equipment to help reduce the strain on manpower by using modernized equipment that is a little more intuitive for the single operator versus needing a team of two to operate one or two systems. So if we can have a team of two being able to do the work of a team of four, that helps us get through that reduction of manpower. But at the end of the day, our reduction to us, we don't see it as being a huge loss to the joint force because we're looking at leveraging people smarter. So every TAC-P that comes to line is already a JTAC, right? So I don't have to spend time grooming them to become a JTAC. When they come to us at the squadron, they're JTAC complete. The other thing we're doing now as well is we're making everyone get through ASOC QC. So when a guy comes to line in the summer of this year, he's going to be JTAC complete. He's going to be ASOC ready. We can best use the person as we see fit in our UTCs.
So, and I think that's an important thing. And I spoke to several TACPs this summer. I was at a JAGIC exercise, and they informed me about the ASOC IQT as well. And having each TACP, JTAC have the ASOC IQT done is so that they can roll either, you can either employ them out of the battalion, and now I can roll them back up. And if they need to be in the JAGIC with the division, they're capable of doing that too. So I thought that was a pretty smart move on the community's part. So the TACP community's got a lot of great capability. Looking at future conflicts, and given that our future operating environment that the Air Force has spent a lot of time looking at in the Indo-Pacific is made of miles of open water, how is the TACP community and how is the land component going to integrate into a fight like that? Without getting into details behind O plans as such, how are we going to use the TACP community and our land component in a AO that is primarily air and maritime?
Hey, Paps, that's a great question. This sets me up pretty well, too, to talk about fundamental changes in the way that TACP does business, right? Because the Pacific Theater is way different than what we've been doing in COIN for the last 20 years. And realistically, majority of TACP and C2 airmen grew up in a post-Cold War, still looking at, how do you defend the Russians from getting through the Fulda Gap mentality. So how do we pivot to what we're going to see in the Pacific? So just like the Air Force made budgetary decisions that led to a reduction of TACP, and we decided to get smarter. One of the things that we had to look at getting smarter was how best to utilize our airmen. Do we do the traditional corps through battalion TACP alignment? And so what we're looking at now is we are going away from an echelon-based unit type code that aligns strictly with an Army unit based off of the capabilities that they present to that one specific node, to a capabilities-based UTC construct where each individual portion of a squadron has a specific portion of the mission set. But since you're trained in all of them, I can flex people around based off what I need to happen. So, having a strike capability, having an integration capability, a command and control capability, and then a command element that gives oversight to those three functions. And that C2 functionality gives you the ability to have an ASOC. But if you don't need an ASOC, now it can do more specialized command control, and maybe it's teaming with a CRC, doing limited command control procedurally, while the CRC is doing extended positive control in a different lane. Integration UTC being the planning and capabilities that gives command control pass through the command node to the forward edge, and that strike capability doing more than just cleared hot, but being a node that understands when it needs to radiate to get targeting data to a striker as it's pushing in for its strike, whether that's a cast strike or an interdiction strike. So again, understanding how the battlefield is changing what we do, and us leveraging what's always been there for TACP, which is that C3 expertise. Now, when you start talking about the Pacific and Counterland, you're right. There's a ton of water. We have for a while experimented with hey, do you put JTACs on boats to do carrier strike group defense, all those kind of things. Where we're landing is more of leveraging C2 to get munitions to the right area on time to the right target. So we see more probably an application of ground commander long range fires and air defense, which requires a high level of C2 connectivity, integration, and pass through. So that's how it looks a little different, I think, in the Pacific Theater. But the same tenets that we are using for command and control need to be transferable to other theaters, right? And then you sprinkle on top of what's specific to that theater. So if I can take those same four capabilities of TACP, strike, integration, command, control, and command, and can I use those in Europe? I think the answer is yes, right? But that's going to be more of a traditional counter land mission. Like, what are the objectives of the enemy? What are the objectives of the friendlies? And how do we exert our will through land maneuver and the use of air power, joint fires, ground fires, all those, cyber non-connects? How do we get all those interspersed? And so again, that's where TACP is going to make its money, is through raw command control, but also helping the ground force integrate all those forces to bear at the right time and place of our choosing to meet objectives.
I think there's a lot of great points that you just brought up in that. So especially when we think about what does the land component bring to a fight in the Pacific, and like you said, the long range fires integration, and air defense, and the command and control of those capabilities and how we integrate them across domains and between services is going to be really important. So I'd like to kind of expand a little bit about how we do command and control and integration of some of those mission sets. So you mentioned airspace defense. So I think most of us in the Air Force, we realize, okay, it's a no-brainer. We have airplanes, so we can do the air-to-air defensive counter-air mission set. But our surface-to-air air defense comes from the Army through the use of Patriot batteries. And anyone that's been to a deploy location is probably familiar with that concept. So there's a whole command and control structure around how we do air defense command and control. But there's also, because you mentioned long-range fires, and the land component is an airspace user as they employ those fires through air component airspace. So whether they fly a rotary wing asset or a UAS, or if they're shooting artillery, so 155 millimeter artillery, or the ATACMS missiles, or the GMLRS, the guided multiple launch system. So it's essentially the M26 rockets that can go for miles and miles, but they take up a lot of airspace to fly. So somebody's got to control the airspace too. So airspace defense and airspace control is important. What role does the TACP provide to assisting the air component or the CFAC in controlling airspace, and how does that work with the land component?
So the CFAC, being the Airspace Control Authority, generally speaking, he's allowed to do the things that he needs to do to prosecute warfare, whether he's the supported commander or the supporting commander. And predominantly we see him as the supporting commander. One of the ways that he can do those roles is he can sublet airspace, right? So the notion of division assigned airspace. As the ACA, he has to ensure that the capabilities are there to control that airspace. And so from his formation, he picks the best trained, best suited for that mission. And we have traditionally seen that with the ASOC. Now, with the fight that was COIN, we saw some changes to how that worked out, right? Because on the linear battlefield, it's a little more simple because your good guys are on one side, your bad guys are on the other. You're lobbing things in, they're lobbing things back. So it's a very linear exchange in some regard. You didn't have that in COIN. The enemy was all around you, 360 degrees. There were no front lines. There were no FIBAs. The FIBAs were the international boundaries of countries that we were in. We needed a way to rapidly integrate all these converging and diverging fires and 360 degree spheres. And the JAGIC made some sense, right? It's a TTP. As we look at the shift back towards a more linear battlefield, we need to look at how that makes the most sense from the CFAC's perspective. And so as he leverages his command control capabilities, TACP, again, understanding based off of the way that we've been trained, how we've been nested, I guess that's the way to put it, across the globe, predominantly at Army bases, we're still doing that integration. And so we're learning how to use those fires. Without division assigned airspace, it becomes a lot harder for the Army to do the counter battery, the counter fire fight, and use fires as they see fit to rapidly change the battlefield, right? To give them decisive advantage. And so the notion of division assigned airspace is, to me, it's a good thing, right? But it comes with some nuances. The Army wants to be able to fire as they see fit as rapidly as possible. And I don't necessarily disagree with that because, again, that's a whole notion of mass and, us controlling the tempo. We have to get flexible and figure some things out. The other thing is we got into a mindset of risk aversion. In the folded gap scenario, having fighters fly under artillery was a fairly normal scenario for training. You're going to shoot back then your 105s to a certain level, and some of your fixed wing are going to fly 5,000 feet or below to cross the battlefield to get to CPs and IPs. So as we get back to this battlefield, we're going to have to undo some of those mindsets of like, hey, this is a hot wall. You can't go through it. I'm probably going to have to take some of that risk. But again, that comes from a command and control entity who understands what the maneuver element needs in order to prosecute warfare and how to best integrate that total airspace picture to achieve objectives.
I agree with the statement you just made about the risk aversion with artillery and long-range fires. So anecdotally, as an exercise that I went to with the Army, trying to integrate with their division artillery unit, which is how the Army currently does their, and you're familiar with this, but the Army currently puts their big guns, the 155 millimeter and above, at the division level for command and control. And so we were doing an exercise with the division artillery over here at Fort Bliss. And it was good in the sense of, hey, we've trained to be able to do calls for fires. I can do a call for fire for artillery from the air. We practiced that airborne, which was an amazing capability. The Army was pretty happy about it because an airborne platform could see a lot further than a surface fires observer can. But on the other hand, it was learning about, hey, how the Army wants to use their fires and how they want to employ them, especially in like counter battery roles or just support a troops in contact type situation, is they're going to start shooting that gun, and they really don't want fixed wing aviation around it, at least at the time. That particular ground commander's like, hey, don't get close to us shooting our indirect fire assets because we don't want to have a fratricide incident. And so there was a lot of back and forth in discussing TTPs of like, hey, we can fly pretty close to you as long as we have a C2Q entity that can communicate where you are and where you're shooting. We can even fly underneath it. But again, we got to have the information. The linchpin to that whole plan was TACPs and TACPs in the ASOC and the JAGIC that helped to make that happen. But again, this all revolved around one particular division, and results may vary, how different division commanders feel about integrating fires. But, sir, I wanted to ask, there's a little bit of word on the street that the Army may be changing where they put their tactical headquarters as they start looking at large-scale combat operations in the future. So they may move their tactical headquarters from the division back to the Corps, which is the next echelon up. Is that going to change how the TACP community integrates with the Army or how we control airspace?
Yeah, just like the Air Force is having to make some changes, right, based off the evolving battlefield and the exit of the coin mentality back to the the large scale combat operation. The Army's going through the same wrestling match, and they're having to make tough decisions. From my perspective, changing to the Corps from the division being the focus, to me, that doesn't really affect much. Now, again, undoing mentalities and paradigms, we've gone down this road of the division aligned ASOC and giving the JAGIC capability, and now commanders are used to that. They're going to want that, right? And so again, us changing the way that we do business inside TACP from being a purely echelon aligned to a capability based UTC, that gives us the option to meet the commander's intent, right? Do I need to be aligned strictly to the Corps just because the Corps is the senior headquarters? No, I need to put my TACP where it makes the most sense based off of the effects that are necessary to prosecute that warfare. So if that just happens to be a TAC PC2 that's on the same patch of Earth as a division headquarters, so be it. If that means based off survivability maneuver, I need to have a TAC PC2 node doing some version of command control at the core to satisfy some of their needs while having another TAC PC2 element of a down trace unit somewhere else, whether that's the division or even maybe slightly lower just based off of your reach of the systems. That's what we need to look at is through dispersion and connectivity, I can be wherever I need to be, right? I just may not be physically present there. That's what we're really trying to get, and to get through the mentality of people is don't worry about what patch of Earth I occupy. Worry about my ability to connect and integrate with the echelon that you need me to connect and integrate through to meet the objectives of the fight.
Trying to meet the ground commander's intent, doing what's necessary, may not look like we've traditionally done it in the past, but we still have the capability to meet the ground commander's requirements and the air component commander's requirements. We just got to build in some flexibility, is what you're saying there.
Yeah, 100%. Again, there were great things that happened with Coin. We were able to exploit some new technologies, figure out some new capabilities and roles for different echelons. The problem is now we've given people that taste, and that's what they want. That's what they grew up with. I'm pretty sure the post-Vietnam era going into Desert Storm had consternation with the way things were going because prior to 20 years, that's what they knew, and there were things that were changing, right? Bombers doing casts. That wasn't necessarily something that was enjoyable in Vietnam, but we started getting a little more comfortable with it in the post-Desert Storm era. So likewise, as we see changes to the battlefield, and in some cases reversions to the battlefield, right? Going back to a linear-based battlefield, we're not saying it needs to be a strict reversion back the other way either, right? That we definitely learned some good things in Coin and best ways to apply command control and techniques to maximize firepower. But you got to add in those new constraints of battlefield geometry and things like that. So flexibility of mentality really helps us a lot with how we can best get after the objectives we're being asked to get after while retaining combat skill for other theaters as well.
Let's strategize this a little bit, and we've kind of already hinted on this some. So considering what we know about Counterland Doctrine with interdiction and cast and how we provide command control, like you're saying, sir, it's a paradigm shift that's going to have to happen in the future. But our future conflicts, the battlefields are going to look different than what we've seen in Coin. The control of the air and the electromagnetic spectrum it's going to be contested, and it's going to be a lot harder to get that on-call cast that I think a lot of our joint partners are used to having 2 ship of A-10s holding overhead, being able to immediately responsive to a developing situation, that's been kind of a luxury that we've had in the counterinsurgency fights in CENTCOM for the last few years, just because the threat level's been so low. But this new battlefield is going to look different with contested control of the air and contested electromagnetic spectrum. So how's Counterland going to look different as we go into our next fight? What are AI and CAS going to look like in the future?
Yeah, I think the introduction of the small UAS is going to propose some solutions in some regard. The lessons we're learning just watching the news from Ukraine and Russia about just how much a man-made drone that costs thousands of dollars, that has maybe a small shaped warhead or something like that on it, how much havoc that can wreak on the battlefield, even when it's not carrying ammunition, because you build in that scare factor. But just knowing that you can put any number of those at any echelon and they can be used at whenever they want, that's going to change some flavors of things. Interdiction, I don't think it's going to change vastly. We're still going to have our target lists that we want to get after that are in the deep area, trying to put the best munition. Different types of munitions are definitely going to give us more options, but also complicate airspace at the same time, which is going to require more integration, planning, command control. As you bring that closer into the close air support arena, just like you said, the threat is evolving. The countries we're worried about, they obviously have surface to air threats to our fighters, so we no longer enjoy the ability to just set up in the wheel, long loiter, and develop targets over time. It's going to be more of the traditional get to your contact point. If you're able to get a good check-in, whether that's over voice, great. If not, hopefully you get a digital, and then from there you're pressing the IP with your best words and trying to meet commander's intent with the munition, and you're no longer loitering over the target to get your own BDA. You're outflowing maneuvers for survivability while you hopefully get a word from the JTAC whether or not you need to realign for a reattack or you're cleared to press off to the next target. Again, we're going to go backwards learning some skills, but the need for CAS is still going to be there. If we put troops in harm's way, we desire to protect them and give them advantage. And we all understand that CAS is an advantage, especially if you can develop that, at least that localized air superiority to enable it. And then long range fires as well, 100% necessity. We don't win battles only on the front lines. We win battles by denying the enemy's capability to get to the front line. I don't think that we're going to see changes in the fact that we're going to do those missions. It's how we do those missions and the way that we prosecute those missions will likely change somewhat based off the technology.
So, sir, all that about how we operate in the future is fantastic. I wanted to ask another question about how the U.S. Army or the Marines, the land component in general, how the ground commander desires to use air-to-surface fires in a large-scale combat operation. Because from my experience and what we've done in counterinsurgency fights in the past is we've done a lot of air-to-land integration, and a lot of it has been, hey, provide overwatch, response to a troops in contact situation, or hit a high-value target. So as we move into a large-scale combat operation, and your experience as an ALO, how do you think a land force commander is going to desire to employ counterland fires? Would they prefer to do interdiction or would they prefer close air support? And I know that's an it depends answer, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
So I'd offer that as an air liaison officer, I've never been to an area where when you're talking with an Army commander that they've never been willing to have aerial fires hit a target, whether that's in the close air support fight or in the air interdiction, mission. I would offer that, just like you said, it depends. The applications of CAS and air interdiction, I've never had a ground commander balk at either one of those, right? They want the munitions and the fires at the point of decision and most impact that changes the battlefield in our favor. Ground commander doesn't want a force making it to the front line. So if the priority of the day is interdiction, they try to preserve that as much as possible. Now, what we find in exercises we've seen even in the real world is based off of the way that the battlefield is flowing, a desire to control the munitions that are just coming into the battlefield without real notion of the ATO assigned interdiction mission versus CAS mission and what that actually means, right? Because the ATO is developed essentially counting munitions based off of Joint Force Commander priorities. So when an interdiction mission comes in, if it's an AI mission on the ATO, those munitions are accounted for against targets. So for us to reflow that means you're now weighing against the Joint Force Commander's priorities for the day. That's being waged, whether that's a frontline force that's decisive battle and needs those munitions in close air support instead of interdiction, that may win out. But what then has to happen is that target has to be recycled, and you have to figure it out whether you're flexing into that in the day's plan or whether that's going to get re-rolled to another day in the ATO. And so there is this struggle sometimes, especially when you start talking about division or portion allocated air, this notion of like, I control those munitions. To a certain extent, that's true for some things like CAS. You can control where those CAS missions go to. You give me a new priority and I now shift your CAS asset from where we thought it was going to where you want it to go. Air interdiction is a little different. I can't necessarily just do that. I have to now let the CAOC know, the AOC know, like, hey, we're going to make a change to the day's battle plan based off of where the ground force thinks they need these munitions to go and whether or not that's acceptable. Sometimes it creates a little friction, but we're usually able to work through those things, right? Rewickering the plan, making sure that you have enough munitions for the day to meet the strikes. Now, get into the world where you have a lot more of surface to air threat. You may not have that flexibility just based off the fact that all your supporting assets that are out there, your SEED, your EW, your ISR, they're all going to make it to that one place they need to be to affect that target. And for you to scrub that plan is going to be a major emotional moment probably for a lot of people. So we're going to get back, I think, again, going back to risk aversion and what it means based off priorities. I think we're going to get back to a point where there's going to be decisions on like, hey, that munition's more valuable in the deep fight than it is in the close fight. Therefore, it's going to stay with the deep fight. And there may be times when we sit there and say like, hey, that effort you're supporting on the ground is the main effort. It's more important to keep that main effort going forward than to strike this tier 7 target that's 1042 on the Japital. So it depends is always a great answer to go to, but when you actually talk about the application of it, it helps wrap people's minds around why would a munition not be easily carried over from one mission to the other mission? You have to look at the totality of what the air campaign is trying to achieve for the Joint Force Commander.
Right. There's a lot to unpack behind that as far as how the joint targeting cycle works and understanding how the air component fits into the joint targeting cycle and how targets get on the JPITL, the Joint Prioritized Target List. I've had some discussions with individuals at the weapons school and at the LeMay Center about the idea of doing air interdiction short of the fire support coordination line. And I think this is kind of what you're getting at with this discussion is when the land component rolls across the battlefield, they throw down the fire support coordination line out there, usually somewhere close to or beyond the division's far boundary, but short of the Corps' far boundary. But that fire support coordination line is the line in the sand that essentially determines who's responsible for the employment of fire. So if it's short of the FISL, if it's on the land component side of the FISL, then the land component is responsible. If it's on the other side of the FISL, the far side, then it's an air component responsibility. And so a lot of the traditional thought is that we just do air interdiction along the FISL because that's an air component type mission, and the air component is the supported component for air interdiction within a theater per our doctrine. But you can do air interdiction short of the FISL. The FISL does not determine the mission set. The thing is, we have to educate our land component brethren on how to get targets onto that prioritized target list so that they can get the munitions allocated to them, just like you're talking about. Because if we don't allocate the munitions to the AI, then we don't give them the sorties they're looking for, and we don't end up doing that mission set in the way that the land component thinks is best to accomplish the mission. I think it's maybe a long way of saying it, but everyone kind of knows that the best way to employ the air power might be to, in a particular circumstance, to attrit stuff that is in the division's deep area before it gets close to the front line. But we have to go through the right command control and the targeting processes to make that happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So again, what defines CAS, right? Is it an ominous line on the ground or a line on the map? Just being shy of that or being long of that is the nomenclature change. Detailed integration. That's an ominous term. If you're going to drop short of the FISL, you do need to do some level of coordination, right? But is it detailed integration, detailed coordination of those fires, right? I'm a proponent of like if you simply sit there and say like, hey, we've got this target, we need to strike it, we need an AI platform, but there's no one really that the effects of that ammunition is going to really affect other than the enemy. and we're not really looking at putting a lot of other fires into it, what level of detailed integration did you really do, right? So where it rests on the battlefield is not that important to me as versus like how much coordination do I have to do to get that munition into that spot on Earth? If I've got to figure out like the fires plan and coordinate with three different fires entities while making sure that an element is outside of weapons effects range or ready for weapons effects, now to me you're starting to talk about CAS. But if you're literally just saying like, hey, this thing is 15 clicks south of the Thistle, and we just wanted to disappear or be affected, and there's nothing else going on with it, cool. Coordinate with your division airspace control element, let them figure out, make sure that the ground component is good with that munition, and you're rocking and rolling.
Yeah, so how close is close air support? And the answer is, again, it depends. It's relative, and it has to do with the tactical situation. So one last topic I wanted to ask you about, and you mentioned this briefly earlier when we were talking about stuff in the Indo-Pacific. So the Army has a new organization within their structure. So they have implemented multi-domain task forces to allow land component to synchronize and employ multi-domain fires to overcome adversary A2AD networks. So to do this, multi-domain task forces are equipped to employ weapons and capabilities that can reach way out across the AOR, such as cyber and hypersonic weapons. We're talking really long-range fires here. Can you discuss the Army MDTF capabilities briefly, and how are they going to affect our coordination for interdiction efforts between the land and the air components? Where do you draw the Thistle on a battlefield with a multi-domain task force?
Yeah, the MDTF, this is a very interesting echelon formation. Really, it's a formation within the Army, essentially getting their A2AD assets, long-range fires assets with strategic impacts, getting them under one commander, right, to meet the needs of the Joint Force commander. The reach of some of the weapons, some of them are going to be new, and we're going to have to figure some of that out. And then some are not, right? We're replacing ATACMs and things like that, but there's surface-to-surface missile capability. We're already used to that in warfare and exercise and practice. So I don't think it's going to necessarily change where the Thistle is. I think what it changes is how the Army, through their echelons of command, how do they do target apportionment? Who's going to get fires, right? Because if you're trying to get promulgation of fires and then getting those fires to mass onto the battlefield, the right spot to make the right effect, I think that's some things just anecdotally I've heard with them wrestling around with like who actually controls the MDTF and the fires and likewise. When we start talking about the A2AD component for the Army, MSHORAD and other things, from my perspective, that doesn't necessarily change too much either because, again, that's an air defense commanders. That's their concern, right? As the AADC, the CFAC still has to figure out a way to integrate that. So you're still going to have that CRC type of capability with your ADAFCO tied into there. That's going to help with that utilization of MSHORAD and new Army air defense weapons to do the counter-air and counter-ballistic missile fight. What's really going to be interesting, though, is when you start talking about the other things in there, the non-kinetic capabilities, the ability to do counter-small UAS with the Army, those are capabilities that everyone is having to wrestle with now as we get into the counter-cyber fight. And so our liaison function to the MTTF is a really big thing. I think the Air Force has to really look at and wrestle with is what is the right composition of people to go and integrate with an MDTF. Is it TACP? That's a great question, right? We in TACP think it's a pretty easy place for us to integrate, especially from the fires perspective. But should we have non-kinetic cyber EW personnel there? Because the things that they're going to be able to talk about at the right classifications in those areas matters. So the MDTF is, like I said, it's an interesting new capability that the Army is bringing to the fight. We would be short-sighted if we didn't pay it the right amount of attention that it deserves from our perspective in the Air Force and how we can best integrate with it.
Excellent. I agree. There's going to have to be a lot of integration at some pretty high levels in order to fully benefit from what an MDTF is going to bring to the fight, even possibly to the point of a lot of those MDTF fires being Joint Force Commander retained type assets where the command and control happens at a very, very high echelon. I do want to note, though, you're talking about the air defense assets that the Army brings to the fight as well as what the MDTF is going to bring to air defense. And that's an entire different podcast episode that I could do on that. And we've been thinking about that at the LeMay Center too, about how do we do counter small UAS? What is the doctrine and the command control behind MSHORAD, and how do we defend an airbase? Those are all considerations those are things that are being discussed at a lot of places right now. So there's more to follow, but there's a lot of work that's got to be done as far as like the infrastructure and getting the equipment to actually execute those mission sets as well. Because right now, some of those things, they don't exist where they need to exist yet. And so we are going to have to develop the doctrine in order to get those capabilities online. But that's a good discussion about MDTF. Colonel Hazy, in closing, with respect to multi-domain operations and Counterland operations in particular, what should the Air Force be thinking about as we prepare for the next conflict?
Hey, perhaps as we close out here, I've thought about this a good bit, just daily here. Being a command and control person myself, I look at how we are approaching this next era and just how we're going about command and control and wrestling with the notions of what do we have in the magazine now and how deep that magazine actually is, right? Budgeting constraints, age of our fleets. We're having to make a lot of tough choices, right? We are retiring aircraft at a rate that we need to make change, but we're a little late to the fight. So being able to leverage what we have now, drawing that bottom line, what we're willing to purge down to in order to bridge the gap, but being smart with the application of what we have left. In TAC-P, we have a mentality here from the command down to the CAF unit, which is, I need you to maximize every bit of every piece of equipment I give you, because I don't know when you're going to get the next new thing, right? And we know that our baseline systems now, some of them are old, but some of them have so much more capability than what we exploit, just because we've never really been asked to exploit those things till now. I see it every AAR. Like, I didn't know my radio could do this, And so getting that knowledge out to the field. And then again, for other people in the Air Force, it's tough to know that your platform is getting cut or these things are happening. The Air Force has to make decisions in order to get us to that next fight and bridge us. So argue with airmen that as things are happening, you've got to see the bigger picture of what the Air Force is trying to do. And the Air Force is not trying to say they devalue your service or devalue what the things your platform has done and is doing. It needs to pivot to the next thing. And that's tough for a lot of people to swallow. I know it's tough for me whenever I saw the E-8 go away. I do acknowledge the fact that was on a Boeing 707, right? It's tough for me to see the A-10 going, but I acknowledge the fact that the Air Force has made decisions based off of budgetary constraints. It's tough for me to see half TAC-P go away. Those three platforms going away has nothing to do with our support to the Army. It has everything to do with budgeting and what we need to get to the next fight to ensure we get there. Now, in the multi-domain operations, we had to keep pushing forward as hard as we can, making operators smarter in multi-domain operations as well, right? We all use computers every day for work. We all use cell phones, things like that. So us being smart and aware of what the threat and adversary can do and across those mediums that we take for granted every day, and the fact that we want to be able to fight off of our computers, we want to be able to fight using telecommunication capabilities like cell phones versus these huge manpack radios. We have to be aware of the risks that are out there with those things and how we counteract those risks and give us some level of surety while also acknowledging the fact that you can't get rid of all risk, right? So how do I make myself more survivable in a highly comm-denied environment or where your communications makes you a target? So getting back to bread and butter of post-Cold War, pre-9/11, radio discipline, command control messages that are formatted, ready to go, synced with time, synced with phases of the operation, understanding when it's your turn to radiate, when it's your turn to be silent, all those things that we had to return to basics that when I look at civilians across my force here that practice this stuff as they prepared for nuclear strikes, they look at it as like, yeah, that's what I was trained to in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay, awesome. We can get back to some of that, but also acknowledge the fact that the battlefield is severely different than 1985. And so, again, I think we have to have a change in mentality, being more flexible in mind, and looking at technology and just the rate of changes. We probably need to look at different acquisition strategies as well, because the longer we go with traditional acquisitions, the further we fall behind.
That's going to do it for this week's podcast. This show is recorded, edited, and produced by the LeMay Center's Doctrine Outreach section. Special thanks to Colonel Scott Hazy, Air Combat Command, the LeMay Center, and Air University. As always, the views expressed by our panel members are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Air University, the Air Force, or any government agency. I'm Keith Conway, and we'll see you next time.